what I wanted to get to talk about today a little bit is just the integration that exists between Dynamics Business Central and Dynamics, all of its different names. Go with customer engagement, CRM, the common data service. Those are all kind of one and the same thing, the same platform. And the integration with CRM in Business Central is a lot better than, even some of the, well, even when GP actually back in the day had that whole like connector thing that was supposed to do something but never really worked properly anyway. The one with Business Central and Nav is actually pretty tightly coupled. So just from a general setup perspective, if you, and it's all sort of from Business Central, all of the running of it is basically on the Business Central side. So if you just look for Dynamics 365, there's a number of pages that are basically views of records from 365. So this is like the actual accounts in customer service, that kind of thing. And here's the actual setup wizard. So I'll go ahead and click on that. And obviously there's some basic information in here just about in terms of credentials of things that you want to point. So we'll talk about this a little bit more in detail in a minute, but just one thing to note is the username that you use here, it filters off of this, so it will ignore changes that were caused by itself. So if you sign in with this and then you make changes to records in CRM, you're going to be very confused as to why it's just not trying to do anything with it, and that's probably because, or it would be because in that case, because you use the same credentials for the sync services for yourself. All right. So I did put together just some slides on this just because I thought it would be worthwhile to have. Some of this is a little bit technical, and having it written down is kind of helpful. So in terms of out-of-the-box integration points, there's a number of things that are already set up for you: customers, contacts, items and resources to products, salespeople, and so on. And there are also a number of like supporting records. It's also possible to map a nav table to a CRM option set. So an option set is, one of those things in CRM where it's basically like a pick list. You can't really, you can with code, but there's not an out-of-the-box way to synchronize an option set with an option set. And that's primarily because nav option sets aren't dynamic. You have to actually go into the properties and set them, whereas in CRM, you can sort of modify option sets using the metadata service. And then I'll just hop back again and just sort of give you an idea of what this kind of looks like. So one of the other things on the nav side, for all of the records that are coupled out of the box, if I go look at like a customer, for example, there's a couple of actions that are related to the sync with Dynamics 365. So for the record that I'm selected on here, these records up here at the top are kind of tied to that. So if I click on the account, for example, then it'll actually punch me out to CRM, and I can see the information in CRM once that loads. You can also force a synchronization with the data that's in CRM. You can tell it to go basically push to CRM or pull from CRM if it's set up as bidirectional. Another really important concept in this integration is this concept of coupling. So basically the way that the integration works is it creates a record in the CRM integration records table that has a pointer to the CRM record. So when you couple it, they become connected at that point. And that's how it does the mapping. It's not tied to like them having to have like the same account number or anything sort of flimsy like that. On the CRM side, I don't actually have it loaded in this environment because I don't have a connection back to Nav because my web services aren't externally facing. But there is a solution that you can install that adds similar capabilities on the Nav side, so you can pop back into, or on the CRM side, so you can pop back into Nav And also it adds like an account statistics. Like it looks kind of like a fact box from Nav for like the account, for example. So it'll show you roll up information from Nav, like outstanding balance and invoices and stuff like that. In terms of configuration that you can do through the front end, sort of out of the box, you have all of those integration points that we talked about, and for the most part, you can't really add additional integration points, but you can configure a little bit how the integration works. Out of the box, most of the records are set up to sync only linked records, so that means ones that you go into and you sort of explicitly go through that coupling process that I was showing a second ago. So it's not going to try and sync account data unless you go in and click that synchronize button, create coupling button in the Nav solution. You can, however, change it so that it will synchronize, basically all of that type of record, but you can further sort of filter that down on either side. So you can say, I only want to filter accounts where the relationship type in CRM is customer, for example, so you don't accidentally synchronize your vendors from CRM into customers in Nav. Same concept applies on both sides. You can also change the direction of it. So, if you want to have CRM be your source of accounts, and that's really the only way you want it to go, you can change that synchronization so that it's just from CRM to Business Central instead of being bidirectional, which is the default. And similarly, if you say, no, I never want them to, I want the information that's in Nav to always be what's pushed to CRM, you can go the other direction as well. You can also do basic field mapping, and that's, so if we go back to that Dynamics 365 setup window, if I click on the integration table mappings, this is basically showing me all of the things that are integrated. And this is my top 10 environment, so there's a number of additional types that aren't actually mapped out of the box. But if we look at a customer, for example, this is where I was talking about how you can set a table filter to filter that down. And then you can also add or edit the field mappings in here. Actually, maybe you can't edit it. I don't know if that's a web thing or maybe you can't change it this way, but at least you can see which fields are mapped to which. And one other thing you definitely can change is you can also apply a table configuration template going either way. And basically what that does is, if we, let's see, I don't know how to see this, select the full list. You can set values for all of these fields that you wanted to apply by default. So things that aren't necessarily part of the actual integration, like customer posting group would be one of those things that you're not going to have that in CRM probably, but you will care about that from a Business Central perspective, or you won't be able to post anything to them. So you can have it specify a field caption. I forgot to start displaying, but are you leaving?
I mean, I'll just look at it on my other monitor.
Okay.
It'll be easier.
Okay, that's fine. All right. So that's kind of the limits of the configuration to the front end. So the next thing any questions on any of that up to this point?
I think I'm good.
Okay. So the next thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was kind of how what the process actually is for automatic integration. So that would be things that you've set to sync more than just the coupled records. So all of the integration with CRM is based on modified on timestamps, and is sort of like a polling process. And all of these are run by job queue entries. So there's a job queue that can be scheduled. You can change the schedule of the job queue, but let's say we'll take customers. Say it runs every 30 minutes. it will run first and check for anything in nav that it sees as being modified, and it will try to run through that process, the next 5 steps there, and then it'll go through and do basically the same process from the CRM or Common Data Service side. The process is a little convoluted, I think, because there's a generic sort of integration service that they actually use for connecting Common Data Service records to many different things like Microsoft Graph and some of the other things. So the first step is basically in that very generic level. So it's just going to pull all of the records that are new or modified, and then it starts running through sort of more of the CRM specific code. So it starts looking at those modified records, and it basically checks again to see if those have really been modified since the last sync. And then it will check the data, if the data has been modified in CRM since the last synchronization. And basically at that point, if it decides that, you know, the modified on date for both is newer than the last sync time for that particular record, it'll kind of throw its hands up in the air and say, well, I can't synchronize this because I don't know which one wins. So you have to kind of go into that actual record and click on the Synchronize Now button, and it will prompt you. It'll basically say this has gone both ways. Which way do you want to do? So you can tell it, I want to take data from CRM or I want to push data to CRM.
Does the developer have any control over that, Paul? Like, for instance, I know that I always want Business Central to be the Bible.
So that goes back to that setup that I was talking about in the first place. If you change that setup, instead of being bidirectional to being to integration table, then Business Central will always be the Bible for that record type.
Gotcha.
So that conflict is only going to be an issue if it is set up as bidirectional.
Gotcha. I understand.
So at that point, then, it basically takes a look at all of the fields that are in that field mapping and sees if the data are different. And if nothing's different, then it's basically just done at that point. Otherwise, it will actually commit the record, and depending on if it's a new record or an update, it'll either insert or modify that record. And then at that point, it'll update the sync time on that sort of like intermediary CRM integration record to say, you know, as of the last time I synced it, this was the modified on timestamp for the source record and for the CRM record. And then it does the same thing from the CRM side if there's anything that's new or modified on the CRM side that wasn't just updated from nav. Actually, I forgot to point this out. One other thing I thought was a little confusing. If you go back to that table, you can run. If you go into the table mappings, there's this synchronize modified records button, which will run for whichever one you have selected here. If you're in the main window, there's a similar button that runs it for all of them. So synchronize modified will basically do the basic kickoff, the process that we just talked about. The run full synchronization button, all that does is reset the last time that it ran the synchronization. So what that means is if there were any new records that for whatever reason were never synchronized, it will attempt to synchronize them at that point. But anything that was modified previously because of that second record that has, you know, basically this is the last time I was modified in CRM and this is the last time I was synced, it will still ignore it. So it's not going to try to do things it thinks have already been successfully synchronized. So from a development standpoint, if you add a new field, for example, there's not really a great process to make it rerun through that push up to everything, other than to go through and modify all the records that you want to push. Okay. All right. So that kind of concludes the business level, I guess, portion of this. And then I wanted to try and jump a little bit more into the specifics of how exactly this is actually implemented, and you know, some of the ways that it can be extended with code.
So Paul,
So
I
in
think that
terms
maybe I
of
did
the,
Paul,
yeah,
I think maybe I did misunderstand a little bit on the front end. Thought, uh, uh, I thought that what was said was that this integrated with CRM and other destination types. Is this strictly CRM with Business Central?
so there's an infrastructure in Business Central for integration management in general. And then there is a specific implementation of that integration management for Dynamics 365. And I have not explored them in a lot of detail, but there you can see bits of code in there running for things like Microsoft Graph. I think there's like an Outlook integrate. I think that's partly how the Outlook integration works as well. But a lot of the code that we're going to be going through here is specific to the CRM sync.
Well, and my thought was, I know we've been going kind of round and round a little bit about what's the best way to integrate data into Business Central. I don't know, maybe I'll shut up and keep listening, but I was wondering if maybe this would be a good solution for that. It was kind of my thought.
Yeah. So one of the strong things for sure about Nav is that unlike GP, it actually has the job queue, right? That's an important development tool. So the job queue it just lets you run a code unit on a timed basis. So it's basically like a SQL Server agent job, but it runs Nav code natively. So from that perspective, for sure, I mean, I think that's somewhat helpful. Certainly, you don't have to rely. I mean, it's cloud software, so you don't have to rely on, having a server or something to run those timed jobs if you don't want to. You can use the job queue to do it. That being said, a lot of the infrastructure, the integration management stuff is not super sophisticated. All it really does at the integration management level is handle those modified on timestamps to let you know basically this is, and it actually creates a record in the integration record table that basically says, this is the last time that this record was modified, because not all of the records in Nav have like a modified on timestamp on the actual record itself. But most of the actual work of integrating it with the other system is sort of on you. The other thing too is that at the platform level, there's support for certain types of quote unquote external records, and we'll talk about that a little bit more for CRM specifically. But basically, you end up creating proxy tables in Nav to work with record types in other systems, and I don't believe that those types are extensible. So you're kind of locked into the types of records that they've already implemented for you at a platform level.
Okay.
The other challenge with that is just that in general, for now at least for Business Central, you don't really have access to the full .NET stack. So your ability to make like web service calls, using .NET code, for example, is somewhat limited. I know that they have been trying to sort of like whitelist wrappers basically for some .NET code, and I don't know if web service calls is one of them or not. I haven't really looked at that yet. That's actually probably a good thing. I probably should look at that.
Okay.
So I guess the short answer, it was a long way of basically saying it depends.
Yeah. Well, from kind of what I gathered from that, maybe I'm reading too much into it. It sounds like there's not really good business logic checking built in for transactions, for instance.
Yes and no. I mean, it's the same as it is everywhere else in Nav. And let me come back to that when I get through this in a little bit more detail. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. I don't mean to get us off track. So.
Yeah. So this is kind of I have a listing of the code units that are actually important, and I have these in sort of the order that they run in. And I've kind of pulled out some of the functions that are kind of the most important. So as I was saying, basically all of the job queue jobs are set up to run the integration sync job runner with, basically a table ID as a parameter. And all that one does is basically pick up the integration record. Oh, the other thing is on the integration record, there's actually like a code unit to run for the integration. So all of the out-of-the-box ones and all the ones I've done are set to use the CRM integration table sync, which is the next step here. But theoretically, and this goes back again to that generic infrastructure, theoretically, you could put a different code unit there, your own code unit, to run a different sync logic. But all the ones that I've worked with to this point run the run method of the CRM integration table sync code unit. And that sort of implements a little bit more of the specific common data service logic. And this is sort of the code unit that handles a lot of the, like, should I ignore this record or should I keep going, that kind of thing. And it has two different functions, for going from nav or going to nav. And then for each sort of individual table, it picks up with the 5335 code unit, the integration table sync. And this is sort of runs for each individual record. And there's a synchronized function on there, and then it drops down into the integration record sync invoke. And this is the one that basically finishes up the timestamp checking that we were talking about before, and then runs the actual logic to transfer fields and to either insert or modify the record. So in the transfer fields function, it basically goes through and it takes all of the fields that are in the mapping and it applies them to the record, right? So the way that this works in nav in general, and in this integration as well, is that it's running the validate triggers on each of those fields, although you can actually control that for each field, whether or not you want it to run the validate trigger. That's just kind of true generically in nav. You can write directly to tables and kind of ignore all of the business logic if you want to, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. And it certainly is more flexible. You don't run into some of the dependency issues that you can run into. It's part of the reason why we never integrate historical records in GP period, because it's such a pain to get everything to go in the right order. And nav, you can kind of just ignore that business logic. But obviously at that point, it's on you to make sure that the business logic that you integrate is, reasonable and not going to break things downstream. So as part of this overall process, Microsoft has decided that you should have some ability to customize this integration yourself. And this is kind of the way that you could, in theory, customize part of the integration using extensions. Because in an extension, these are all external events that you can trigger off of, and you can do your own logic there. So the out-of-the-box code unit is going to basically pick up a record, run through all of the fields, and apply them, and then insert or modify that record depending on if it's a new record or not. But that's, obviously that's not always how things need to work. So you have some extension points, and there's a link in the end of this presentation back to it's the walkthrough from the Microsoft Docs site that has more details on what exactly each of these fields are. The ones that are probably the most important is on after transfer records. So that's basically it's pulled all of the fields that it has across in the mapping, but it hasn't yet attempted to insert or modify that record. You can do additional mapping in code, and then you can tell it that yes, other fields were modified. So this is kind of an opportunity to do mapping to records that are not fields that are not directly on the record itself. So an example for this is with top 10, we wanted to integrate the height and width and depth of products, and those are set up as item attributes. So that's another table that has basically, a one-to-many relationship with the item record. So I implemented logic in there to basically pull that across and then say, yes, this field changed, it was modified. Because if you don't do that, it'll say, oh, well, the only thing that changed was an item attribute, then nothing's changed and it won't commit any changes. The one actually on here that I didn't actually mess with, and I probably should have. I didn't. This wasn't in the walkthrough really, which is probably why I missed it. But the on-transfer field data is an opportunity for you to say in that setup, I want to do this field to this field, but I want to, maybe they don't share a data type, for example. So I need to do data type conversion. You can do it in this code unit, or sorry, in your trigger there. Yeah. So one other code unit of interest is this 5341, which is the CRM integration table subscriber. And this handles many of these events for the out-of-the-box integration. So you can kind of get a sense of how they're using it to map things that aren't necessarily a one-to-one mapping exactly between Business Central records and CRM records. Okay, so that is kind of the extent of what you can do in an extension. So the downside here is that, like I said, you can't really create new integration points in an extension, at least not yet. So there's a process, and this is again in that walkthrough with the link at the end. There is a process for creating those proxy tables that I was talking about. There's a new nav CRM table command in the development shell that basically you give it a connection string to CRM, and it uses the metadata service of CRM to pull back what a record in nav should look like in order to talk to a record in CRM. And it generates a bunch of text files, which look something like this. So we'll look at, I don't know what this is. This is the CRM system user. So this is a CRM user, and here are all the attributes that it has on it. So system user is a GUID. Part of the reason why you can't actually do this in an extension, other than the fact that this table type property tells you immediately is unallowed, is there's also all of these external attributes that these don't even actually show up in the development shell or the regular development thing. So if I look at the same table, and I look at the same attribute. It has some parts of this. It has the external name. So this is the actual internal technical name for the field in CRM. But you can tell it does not have all of the attributes. It's missing the external type and external access. So one thing to note also is you also cannot edit directly in here because it will clear out the external properties. So if you need to make a change to one of the tables that's in the out of the box to begin with, you have to export it to a text file, make the change in the text file, and then import it back in. And then actually I'll leave this out. So other places, once you've created your new table, and imported it, the other pieces that you need to do to make sure that it'll actually integrate properly is you need to edit the 5150 integration management code unit. I'm on pages table 51. I miss it. Maybe that was the wrong one. Oh no. I don't know why. Oh, right. I forgot I changed this. So there is an on is an integration record um, uh, event that you can implement, but the walkthrough tells you to modify this. So ultimately, what this does is you go through here and you add any table on the nav side that you want to be part of the integration. Otherwise, the integration records that have the timestamps that are used to, for it to tell whether or not it should synchronize it won't be created. So that's kind of just how that part knows that it needs to do that. Oops. Also, there are some parts of the CRM setup default code unit that need to be modified in order to basically tell it, this table is mapped to this table, that kind of thing. And then the CRM setup defaults, you can to some degree go just edit, the integration table itself. But if anybody comes in and clicks this, nope, not here. Use default synchronization setup, it's going to basically clear out all of the mapping that's in there and rerun that code unit to actually rebuild it. So the correct way for sure is to put your code into this reset configuration and write out all of the code necessary to actually put your mapping in there. Any questions on that?
No, I think I'm good.
All right, so that's kind of at a high level the things that you have to do and kind of the idea of the process. I've run into a number of things though that I would consider kind of gotchas, some of which I've talked about, but I'll just sort of go through these anyway. That I think the first one that confused me the most was just that full synchronization doesn't actually do a full synchronization. It only does a synchronization of records that are prior to the last time the synchronization occurred, but weren't successfully synchronized in the first place. Another thing that I ran into is that if you, yeah.
As far as what this considers synchronized records, does the developer have any control over, like if you want some other records synchronized that have already been done, does the developer have any control over marking that as unsynchronized or no?
Yeah, I mean, yes, but it's not necessarily straightforward. So there's a table, there's two tables. So if we look at CRM integration, I'm doing code units yet again, table. So I just run this. This has got the last sync modified on and the last sync CRM modified on. So you can manipulate the values in this table to tell it, if you backed this up, for example, it would think that the CRM record needs to be synced and try again, right? So it is possible to do it, but you'd have to write your own action. There's no button out of the box in the out of the box configuration that would go reset this particular sync. The easiest way, honestly, in a lot of cases, is to just modify the record because that'll run the modification trigger on either side. You can either update the modified on field in CRM or the integration record table in nav, and then the next time you synchronize modified records, it'll pick it up.
Okay, cool.
Does that answer that question?
It did. Yep.
Another thing that confused me a little bit and was sort of the first time that I saw frequently that error message that basically said, and it was for a customer, it said, This customer has been modified in CRM and nav since the last time you ran a sync, so it can't be synchronized. And I was like, I don't understand. I didn't change anything. And then ultimately, what I figured out the problem was again, because it's using those modified on timestamps, there was a asynchronous plugin that was running in CRM for, in mine, it was running for as part of the field service thing to actually find the latitude and longitude of a particular customer. And because every update in CRM will change the modified on field, it was, every 10, 15 seconds after the sync ran through, that asynchronous plugin fired and updated the latitude, longitude, and caused the modified on date to change. So you need to make sure that everything is either running in real time on CRM or is just disabled, because it will definitely screw up that synchronization process. I also ran into a number of order of operations tables with table triggers. So, and this is kind of something that I've been fighting in general with nav. I don't really know. I don't think there is a great answer to it. So, in nav, you can implement business logic, in either a page or in a table. And the proper way to do it would be to implement them in the table, for the most part. But there is a lot of assumption in many of the code or the tables in base nav that you are editing that record from a page. And so the scenario of how a record, the life cycle of a record in a page is not the same as the life cycle of a page in a web service, or a record in a web service or in this integration record. So again, if you remember, what I said was it transfers all of the fields and then inserts it. In an average page, most of the time, the record gets assigned its key fields and then is inserted and then modified as you add additional records to it. So what that means is that some of the modified on triggers for individual fields will assume the record has already been inserted and will start causing all kinds of problems if it hasn't been. So I have found myself in some cases having to, implement a lot of the mapping of attributes, sort of by code after the record has been inserted. And sort of on a same flavor, depending on the table, there are also some, and the values that are entered. This should be completely disallowed if it was up to me, but it is possible to prompt for confirmation, for example, in a validate trigger for a field. And what will happen, obviously, is you're just going to get it stuck with a dialog just sitting there. A lot of records in nav have ways to programmatically disable those dialogues by use of calling like a setter function. So like the service header is an example of this. There's like a set hide confirm dialog function that you can call with the value true, so that if you change anything that would ordinarily prompt the user to confirm that they want to do it, instead it just goes ahead and accepts it. But the out-of-the-box mapping is not going to call that function. And then also, so that they can be used generically, all of the code unit functions that actually map things across are called with record references. And the downside of a record reference is you can set all of the data properties on them, but you can't call the functions of the underlying table. So what I ended up doing in that case was basically just committing everything up to that point, loading the actual table, calling that hide confirm dialog box, changing my value, and then saving it again, and then reloading the record reference so that it would be up to date and could continue on. It's kind of a pain. So the other thing, I already mentioned this, which was that you cannot create or modify a common data service proxy table in an extension. So for the time being, customizing this CRM integration is really an on-premises only exercise. It's really not truly possible, if you ask me, in the cloud version. At least with the NAV 2018 development shell, for me, I could not get the new nav CRM table to run unless I had Fiddler running. It would basically give some sort of authentication error every single time. And my guess would be is that is probably something stupid around like SSL. So probably the nav CRM table doesn't support TLS 1.2, and that's the only thing that CRM supports now. So the way that Fiddler works is it basically gets in between. It creates its own trusted SSL cert on your machine and then uses that when it's communicating with your machine. So that's my guess as to why it works with Fiddler running, but not otherwise. But just keep that in mind that if you get a authentication error and you're pretty darn sure you have the right password, that it might be that you just need some sort of SSL proxy to fix it. Another thing too is that you have to run that new nav CRM table for all of the tables that you want to generate at the same time. And the reason for that is that if you have any links between them, so like a contact has like a lookup to the account that it's associated with, it will ignore those lookup attributes if the target type isn't included in the list of tables that you want to generate proxies for. So even though you may only be trying to generate a proxy for one table, you need to include all of the tables that one table references, or you won't get those references in the attributes that are created. I didn't put it on here, I guess, but similarly, you also, and I already mentioned this, you have to edit the CRM properties in the sort of exported table text file. You can't do it in the development designer. And then I kind of talked about this already as well, but there's a flag in the on-after transfer record fields that says basically whether or not additional fields were modified, and you do need to set that if you're mapping anything by code, or it will never commit anything to the change. So it'll just kind of keep on running. And then these are the resources that you can sort of get from the slideshow, which I'll send out in an email, but is also in the files section of the emerging tech team, the BC-CDS integration customization. So that's kind of what I had planned on going through. Does anybody have any questions or anything at this point?
No, it makes sense to me at least.
Okay. Yeah.
No questions. Admittedly, a lot of it's over my head, but I appreciate just the walkthrough, so that at least it's kind of in my vocabulary, if you will, when I think about these things.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I thought there was a question there. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I'm trying to break these up a little bit so that the first part is kind of more of a business use case walkthrough, and the second part is the more technical part. But
well, it's still, I don't expect to walk away to knowing how to do the technical part, but just knowing what's possible, so that I can speak educatedly about it, and knowing, oh, this is an option. Let me go to Paul or Eric and see what we can do.
Yeah, sure.
Well, and
all right.
Yeah,
well,
I mean, no, go ahead.
Was that?
Sorry.
Well, I was gonna end it. If you have something else you want to share, now's the time.
No, that's good. Well, good.
All right, cool. Well, thanks, you guys. Talk to you later.
Thank you, Paul. Man,
thanks, Paul. You did record it, so you'll send the recording to everyone.
Yep, I will do that.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. You put a lot of work into that. That was a good presentation. Appreciate it.
Cool. Talk to you guys later.